It's the holiday season, and we want to celebrate with you. Join us on Friday, December 10th from 1:30 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for Connect Together's Holiday Get Together, a safe online holiday gathering via Zoom. There will be an escape room, ornament making, a musical performance, trivia, and giveaways galore. Space is limited, so register today at ctholidayparty2021.eventbrite.ca. Come have some fun and celebrate with our wonderful community. We look forward to seeing you there. As an individual who has a son that is, your whole family is reliant on accessible parking, what are some of the frustrations and headaches that you have to deal with on a daily basis?
One thing I found with the amazing people I've met in the disability community is that we're all used to making do. And that's probably our downfall as well. Um, when we're going to an event, for example, at the local arena here in Victoria, the first challenge you face is finding parking. The parking that they have was done to the minimum standard that they could do under the building code, which is actually very narrow. Um, and there's very little of it. So if that's not available, now you're trying to find surface parking around the arena that's suitable. And even just looking for regular street parking, you face barriers like grass boulevards that are muddy and the wheelchair sinks in, or the new trend with a lot of these bioswales that they put in that actually have curbs and then a ditch that's got all sorts of plants in it, which is great for the environment, but not very good for accessibility. Um, and then a lot of legacy parking spaces as well, or where perhaps a business or a building has changed use over time, and the accessible parking is maybe a standard car parking space, or sometimes a really horrible one that's narrow and steep, and that's what they've got marked as an accessible space because it was convenient. Um, there's when people are making changes, often they don't consider what are the actual needs for an accessible parking space. And even with some of these businesses that are trying to do the right thing, they've got their service area outside and they want to put an accessible parking space in, and so they put a sign on what was a standard car parking space before, not realizing that without that extra width, there's a lot of people that just it's not suitable for.
It sounds like, just from all the responses you're giving, a big issue that I'm finding is awareness. It's people are so focused on something else, be it convenience or going green or what have you, that we completely forget about accessible parking and taking it from the perspective of the individuals who actually have to rely on it. How do you what do you think needs to be done in order to really expand this awareness?
There was a great example at COP26 in Glasgow last week. The Israeli energy minister uses a wheelchair, and she could not get her adapted vehicle to the venue to be able to participate.
Wow.
And to the Israeli prime minister's credit, he said, if she can't get in, I'm going home. So it is starting to get noticed, but a lot of these initiatives, whether it's active transportation, um, reducing the overall number of spaces for cars. In some of the parks, like Stanley Park in Vancouver and Beacon Hill Park in Victoria, the municipalities or the Parks Board have closed roads and restricted access. These are all initiatives that have merit in climate action. In that, to what degree, I'm not sure. But when you're leaving out 25% of the population in your climate action uh, um, projects, you're really setting yourself up to fail. Um,
Right.
we can't have a global climate action if we're not going to ensure that we include people with disabilities. We are a large or I shouldn't say we, my son, people like my son are a large part of the population.
No, absolutely. Um, do you feel that individuals who are reliant on accessible parking face stigma?
We do at times. Especially, if you see an issue like some of these businesses and that have blocked their accessible parking, especially those that haven't provided an alternative. When you say something, the public backlash sometimes can be quite full of vitriol. We've seen the same thing with the city of Victoria, with the closure of roads at Clover Point and the roads in Beacon Hill Park, where people with disabilities have said, "Hey, we need access here. We can't walk 200 meters." In Beacon Hill Park, it was access to the only accessible washroom in the park, as well as areas that were used by various disability organizations within the center of the park for health and wellness activities. And you know, using COVID as an excuse to make these initial closures for supporting physical distancing and then pushing it forward as a climate action activity afterwards, and creating that sense where the community has already adopted it as a pedestrian zone and excluded people with disabilities. It really starts to create a situation where these local governments and others start to villainize members of the disability community, and no one should ever feel guilty or villainized for simply asking for equitable access.
How do we break down the stigma?
I think it needs to be awareness. um, you know, I look at our starting right with grade school. Like my kids are in grade 3 and grade 5 right now, and we've got sexual orientation and gender identity curriculum, we've got Indigenous curriculum, we've got Black Indigenous people of color or anti-racism curriculum, but there's no curriculum that's standardized to start creating that awareness about disability as well. I often refer to disability rights as second class rights, because you wouldn't build a restaurant or a place where you keep out members of these other communities. But for some reason, it seems to be acceptable to build a facility that has barriers that keeps people, members of the disability community, out just through the physical design.
What are some of the systemic problems uh, in terms of like the actual implementation of accessible parking?
So there's a few. The first one is a lot of our environment is already built, and accessible parking standards, previously in the building code, now hopefully coming under provincial accessibility legislation. They tend to be what's called a point in time requirement. So, for example, when a building is constructed, it's built to the building code that's in place at that time, and you don't have to adapt it until you're doing a major renovation, or a major addition. So we've got a lot of legacy accessibility barriers, including parking, that are there. But I also find that there's uh, a perception that it doesn't really have that much of an effect in the community. Um, there's certainly those that do recognize it, many people in local governments and that do. But then there's the other side that say, there's not that many disabled people. They don't have any money. Well, I can assure you that some of the people that are seniors and disabled that live in Sydney and Oak Bay have lots of money, and they would love to come and spend it at a decent restaurant, but they need parking to get there. So it's these attitude is probably the number one actual barrier to moving forward, and recognizing as well that it's not just the person with a disability that it affects their family, their friends, their colleagues. It's a much broader impact than just one person.
You're, of course, going beyond the call of duty in terms of actually combating these issues. But what sort of changes outside of your control uh, do we need to begin implementing?
So, as an individual, I've been able to advocate at the local level, but we really need to start getting things happening on a larger scale. And this is again where the province comes in with accessibility legislation and accessibility regulations. Over the last while, we've had a number of groups start to form, that are really a collaboration between different disability organizations such as Spinal Cord Injury BC, Possibilities in Langley, the Social Planning and Research Council BC, and that. And we're starting to gain some momentum. This project that was done with Spark, and the city of Vancouver on the dimensions, I think was a really important step, because now we have the data to be able to show the province when it comes time. This is the standard that works. So it's but really, it's um, unless you've got a local government that's receptive, or any public body that you're dealing with that's receptive, it's really out of your control.
It sounds like incredibly frustrating work, but I imagine that it can also be rewarding too. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's like any group of people, or group of whatever. There's always going to be the tough nuts, and there's going to be those that are an absolute pleasure to work with. And you take joy in the ones that are a pleasure to work with, and you group together and you gnaw away at the ones that are more of a challenge. But in time, we will get there. It's what I'm starting to see now, is that accessibility and the needs of the disability community are starting to come a little more sharply into focus than they have been in the past. There's been an incredible number of other issues affecting different equity seeking groups over the last few years that have certainly taken the spotlight. Um, but uh, until we start to recognize that providing equitable access to one group does not mean taking it away from another, and providing an opportunity for the message of each and every group to be able to be heard at volume and clear. It doesn't matter which equity seeking group you are. That's when we're going to start to see some real progress, I think, on all of these issues. And the interesting thing with disability is it is very intersectional. Every other right seeking group is going to have members who are part of the disability community. And it's also the largest minority group, and any one of us can become a part of it at any time for reasons that we couldn't even fathom.
Mm. Is there a specific moment since you started this project that you find to have been like your greatest accomplishment?
I don't think I've had a greatest accomplishment yet. I know that certainly the work that I've done here on the peninsula has been very rewarding. It's actually leading to more work in the realm of accessibility and the needs of the disability community. It's actually leading to the formation of a intermunicipal advisory committee for disability issues. That's going to bring the three municipalities together to help align some of the accessibility guidelines and other elements around the disability community. So it's starting to snowball and gain momentum, and it's starting to get exciting. Um, Seeing some of this stuff start to come to fruition. For anyone that's starting out on an advocacy challenge or an advocacy role, that first while is incredibly difficult. Um, it feels like you get a lot of doors slammed in your face, but once you find that one that opens, it starts to give you hope, and it helps you develop that network and connections, and then it can really start to take off.
What's been your greatest challenge in this line of work?
Keeping my temper. you know, the biggest challenge is dealing with people. I shouldn't even say dealing with people. Trying to work with people to help them to understand the importance of standards. One of the hashtags that I'll use sometimes on posts is standards matter. Um, you know, when organizations think that sort of taking an average of what other communities do and say, well, that's not best practice. That's you're trying to be mediocre, and do you really want to be mediocre? Because I see you going for gold standard in these other certainly more contemporary and sexy projects. Accessibility isn't always sexy, but it can be. And at the end of the day too, parking aside, everyone benefits from an accessible entrance to a building.
Hmm.
Everyone benefits from those power doors. Everyone benefits from a park that's designed so that grandparents can go with kids, can go with moms with strollers. Um, we need to stop thinking of accessibility as something that's separate, and it needs to be adopted as part of the fabric of just how we operate as a society and how we design our communities.
What motivates you to continue enacting change through your work with Accessible Parking BC?
Number one's my son.
Yeah.
He's turning 8 next week. He's a happy little guy. He's nonverbal, but I tell you, his eyes and his smile tell me everything. The other thing, at first it was just trying to make change and trying to get the message out. But what I found in doing this work is I have met some absolutely incredible people. Other advocates and other people that are needing these accessible elements in the community. And I've had a crew before being a captain on a ship, and as a pilot, my job is to go on board a ship, someone that's not part of the crew. I'm there for a few hours and I go home, and I haven't had a crew in a long time. I'm starting to feel like I've got a crew again. I've got an amazing group of people that I'm surrounded with in the network, all working for a common cause. And the way that we can lean on each other for support, and that it's incredible. It's really like an extended family for me now.
What can we expect to see in the future from Accessible Parking BC?
Hopefully some stuff at the provincial level. I'll continue to work with the other disability organizations and accessibility organizations. Locally here, I try to provide free accessible parking signs that are compliant with the Motor Vehicle Act regulations to local businesses. I haven't had great uptake on it, but I've managed to give away a few. I'm really surprised when people turn down free stuff, but okay. But just continued advocacy. I'm finding that it's important to maybe start looking more at bigger impact. It's one thing to go community by community, but again, we've got 168 plus municipalities across the province, and I certainly, having a full-time job elsewhere and a family, I can't take that on. There's other amazing advocates that are working on it, but we really need the province to step up. Like, this is something that should have been addressed when it came out of the building code, and we need that senior leadership to help make this happen.
How can our listeners support Accessible Parking BC?
Support your local accessibility organizations. Tell them that this is what you need. I'm a volunteer consultant for a lot of these organizations like Spark and the Victoria Disability Resource Center and Spinal Cord Injury. I volunteer my time. I'm focused on standards and regulations. I've looked at regulations from across Canada, the US, Europe. And I'm talking not just about the design standards, but also enforcement regulations, because that's an important part of it as well. If you go to the US and you park in a accessible parking space without a permit, you could face a $700 fine. You go to Ontario, and if you do it, especially if you've got someone else's permit that you're not supposed to be using, it's a $400 fine for parking in a disabled zone without a permit. It's a $400 fine for falsely using a permit. In BC, we still look at the municipal bylaws, because that's where it's usually ticketed at $25, $50, maybe $150. And this is also where that signage comes in. If it's signed as with the Motor Vehicle Act sign, at least they can be ticketed under the Motor Vehicle Act regulations, which is a $120 fine. But even still, it's we'd rather not use the big stick. But if the municipalities and that aren't going to give us the supply that we need, then we need to start looking at the enforcement side of stuff.
Where can our listeners learn more about Accessible Parking BC and keep in touch with you?
Best thing to do is to look us up on Facebook, Accessible Parking BC. It's just like the bottom of the provincial accessible parking sign. It's got the black wheelchair glyph with a green circle. And reach out to me through there. I'm happy to share information. A lot of what I do is as an information hub. I can provide references to materials in that. If you're working on a bylaw with your local municipality, or if your municipality wants to reach out, I'm certainly here and happy to share whatever I can.
And we're, of course, going to leave the links to that in the description of this podcast. David, thanks so much for coming on and speaking with us today.
Thank you so much, Sean. I really appreciate it.